So thank you all for coming. Welcome to the Neuroverse and SWC panel event. The question of today's event is, will computational models / machine learning ever be able to replicate the full complexity of the brain? Over the past year, we've created a series of podcast episodes with a variety of guest speakers from SWC, including our panelists here today. And I think I may spot a couple more in the audience. And this series has enlightened what the forefront of systems neuroscience is achieving regarding animal cognition, from mice playing computer games to naturalistic foraging behavior, as well as the really cool learning techniques that have been developed inspired by neuroscience and have now become a domain of their own.
Through this series, I've learned a lot about the value of combining computational and experimental methods to understand the brain. And in order to encapsulate one of the major themes that kept appearing across episodes, we settled on this fascinating question of whether computational models can actually replicate the full complexity of the brain. And it's a particularly relevant question, of course, given the increasing role of machine learning in the field of neuroscience, and the recent Nobel Prize in Physics being awarded to John Hopfield and Geoffrey Hinton for their foundational discoveries in artificial neural networks, proving the value of these tools in our world today. But are these models directly related to our biological brain? Today, we hope to bring into question the future of neuroscience and the place for computational models in it. So now let me introduce our panelists. First, online, we have Clémentine Dominé, who's a PhD student working with Andrew Sachs and Caswell Berry on continual learning, reversal learning, and the acquisition of structured knowledge. We also have here Jai Bhagat, who's a PhD student in Tiago Branco and Tom Risick-Flogel's labs here at SWC, performing experiments involving continuous recordings of freely moving rodents during decision-making tasks in naturalistic environments.
We also have joining us Pierre Glaser, who is a final year PhD student working with Arthur Gretton on training and evaluating predictive probabilistic models with a particular focus on scientific applications. We also have Aaditya Singh, who is carrying out a PhD on learning dynamics of various strategies and circuits in deep neural networks with Andrew Sachs and Felix Hill at UCL. Now, before we get started, I want to first introduce the layout of the panel event. First, Clara or I will ask the panelists a question, and they will discuss or argue amongst each other. And then we'll open the event to the audience. Please do come up and ask your questions. We have a mic over there, and we also have a mic here that will be passed around if you raise your arm. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the questions that we asked today. So, to get us started, I will first ask a more general question to all of the panelists, starting with Clémentine. What does thinking mean to you in the context of computational models and the brain, and do they have the same definition, Clémentine?
Yeah, so first, thanks for having me. And yeah, I'll try to answer the question. So in my opinion, thinking is really about information processing, and that is, I think, the common idea in between AI and the brain. But of course, there are some differences in between them. So in neuroscience, the brain performs this thinking through the interactions of neurons, for example, neurotransmitters, etc. And we really relate to it through the subjective experience of thinking, such as thoughts or feelings and sensation. While in AI, it's really a predefined set of rules without really, we think, any subjective experience or self-awareness in the thinking. And they just execute a program with input-output, with some feedback sometimes. But I would really distinguish it from neuroscience through this subjective experience and also the way the thinking is done, like what substrates the thinking is done. But I think it all comes down to information processing at the end of the day.
Yeah, I agree with Clem a lot. I think only small things I would add are when you even use the word thinking, you should think about if you're speaking from kind of an egocentric metacognitive point of view, in the sense like, is thinking me thinking that I should do something, or if it's just information processing, then do the simplest organisms think whenever they're doing anything, right? Whenever yeast is moving down towards like a sugar gradient, is that thinking, or is that because it's information processing? Or does thinking require some kind of metacognitive ability? And if it does, then probably computational models aren't thinking, but maybe Aaditya wants to say something about if they are.
Yeah, so I think I'll definitely interesting points raised by Jay and Clem. I'll offer a bit of a counterpoint, I think, from the AI side of things. I think thinking I mean, everybody thinks we know how to think, right? And we're thinking. Some people define that in terms of like information processing, some ability to generalize, some ability to like do new things or figure out stuff, right? You typically have to think to figure out how to do something. I think a broader definition I like to adapt for thinking is the ability to use more resources, whether that be like time, computational power, energy, to change your behavior in some way. So it's like a very broad definition, but once we go to that, we can see how like, for example, following a sugar gradient, a good example Jay gave, like I think most of us wouldn't perhaps view that as thinking. And I think there's like, you're not really changing your behavior by spending more time or energy. And then bridging to the AI side, I think earlier AI systems did have this very like prescriptive rule-based systems where like you might have like a search algorithm that figures out how to make the next move in a chess game. But now by kind of emulating the emergent phenomena we see in the brain with like bunch of neurons working together to do some computation, we're also starting to see systems like, I guess, OpenAI's new O1 model, which seems to show some pretty interesting behavior that I honestly don't know what to call other than thinking. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think those are all great points. Personally, I struggled a lot when I saw this question because I think that like finding out what really is thinking is a question that people have asked for decades, if not maybe centuries. And there are elements of answer, I think, to provide from a computational perspective that, there's an entire field that's called the computational theory of mind that essentially tries to frame what the brain does as computations, right? And indeed, if we start having this kind of maximalist perspective by saying that thinking is just computation, we end up quickly with this kind of example that Jay, for example, mentioned, right, where we have very, very simple computation that are performed in some systems and that wouldn't necessarily qualify as thinking, right? But on the other end, I think the kind of framework, the kind of computational framework that's provided by algorithmic learning theory and machine learning, by studying, we kind of realize that little by little, I think theory and learning algorithms are slowly converging toward things that are a bit more human-like. And so, for example, if you look at maybe the more foundational computational model up there, it's the Turing machine. And the Turing machine is just an abstraction for a computer. It's just what mathematicians use in order to study what a computer is able to do. And it's just a simple mathematical abstraction that is pretty much able to compute anything that's reasonably computable. Okay, but the Turing machine, as it's the abstraction of a computer program, is very different from a human being. First of all, it only has a finite amount of states, whereas what we assume kind of the number of states that a human can occupy is continuously valued because a lot of the parameters that describe our brain are continuously valued, right? And second of all, it doesn't really interact with the environment so much. So in a sense, it operates more as it's given an input and then it executes a series of instructions without having this kind of feedback loop that is really, I think, of like the telling of a human being interacting in an environment. And therefore, I think statistical learning methods, and in particular reinforcement learning algorithm, where little by little we've managed to kind of like, I think, describe in a bit more accurate manner how human interacts in an environment. And that was good, but now I think we're at the limits where we're really able to do precisely what Aaditya said, which is not only create kind of a situation of an agent evolving in an environment, but also scaling up the amount of compute that is spent to answer a question. And so, for example, if we look at AlphaZero, the algorithm that was used to beat Stockfish, which was the previous engine that was the best at chess and which already beat humans, what AlphaZero performs when playing is Monte Carlo tree search, which is essentially a way to simulate a lot of games at inference time, so when actually playing the game, to figure out which is the best move to play. And the way moves are proposed is using a neural network. So there is kind of like this scale-up of inference time that relies on neural network but on this kind of like deductive algorithm that can be seen as the deductive component of our brain. In a sense, right, we have this deductivist logic component of our brain. And I think what Monte Carlo research is precisely abstracting away that as part of a deductive non-linear algorithm. Whereas on the other end, the proposal that makes the move is precisely the imaginative part of our algorithm. So I think we arrive from like, a very bare, simple computational model to this kind of algorithm that are now at the state of the art, which are replicating a lot of components that we might attribute to thinking. It's the same that we observe, for example, with alpha proof, the recent DeepMind project, right, which uses essentially a theorem over a formal theorem verifier to make sure that the proposal, which are made by the AI probing algorithms, are actually correct. It's similarly this kind of deductive part, I think. So work in progress at, I think, getting towards a unified theory of, I think, computation and thinking, is my opinion.
Thank you. Really excellent answers from all of the panelists. I enjoy the use of different model organisms to make your points. Shall we move on to the next question?
Do we have any questions or comments from the audience first? Sorry.
I do encourage you to come up and use the mic, or if you wave your hand, Shubham can pass you another mic. No comments from the audience? Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I have a question for you. So yeah, you mentioned computationalism, and I guess at its core, computationalism is the idea that everything in the universe can be reduced to a computation. Would you agree with that? Or like, would you agree with that definition? And then would you also call yourself computationalist?
I think it's a very attractive thesis because, in a sense, it's very maximalist. It reduces a very complex problem, which is figuring out what does thinking mean, to a very simple answer, computation. And I think I have a lot of biases in the way I think, and one of the biases are seeking for simple answers. And so I think this one is attractive, but of course, we quickly end up into this kind of weird things where, kind of like, is it, for example, that particles in a wall, right, which are kind of following the law of nature, are they computing anything? It's not even following a gradient when you're a small organism. It's actually just an inert set of particles that are still following the law of nature. Well, they're kind of simulating an algorithm, and this algorithm is just like the way it goes. It's doing computation, and sometimes it's isomorphic to an algorithm that simulates that. And people have used this particular example to say that actually the computational theory of thinking is flawed. So I think sometimes we tend to be a little bit too anthropomorphic also with this kind of, approach toward thinking. For anthropomorphic, I don't know, for people who might not know this word, is like using too much of our like human experiences in order to describe terms which at the end of the day may not be that special. Is thinking that special? Is consciousness that special? Maybe we ascribe it a special meaning because we're humans, but if we take a slightly broader view, maybe all of this is mechanistic and computable. It's a bit of an admission of defeat because I think we're not trying to make the most out of the complexity of these phenomena by just saying that, but on the other end, it's a bit appealing because of its simplicity.
I would also like to just ask Aaditya a quick question. Because what came to mind as you said that thinking requires changing your behavior was immediately a plant growing towards sunlight. So how would that fit into what you said? And would you consider that thinking? And if not, why?
Yeah, so I think there it's like, there's like a level of like abstraction where I guess you could argue that everything, like if you say our behavior is to think, then I guess we can't really change that, right, by thinking more. I think the plant example, I would say it's not thinking in that it feels like it's a lower level of abstraction where we can kind of describe its behavior, and somehow the plant spending more time would not lead to changing its behavior, right? If we say like time is one of these fundamental resources. Whereas if I put a human in a dark room for like 2 days, right, with no stimuli, there's like nothing to force them to change their behavior, but like I doubt the human would just stand still in the center of the room, right? They would think and then they would change how they're responding to the exact same stimuli as a function of spending more time. And that's, I think, going back to like the O1 example, like ChatGPT, these language models that I'm sure everyone has used for the longest time, like when you ask it a question, it'll give you a response, right? And then you can do some things to kind of change its response by just like sampling at some different temperature, which basically just lets the model give a different output, but it's using the same probabilities to generate that output. I think O1 is really interesting in that you can actually let the model think for like a certain amount of time, and the output it gives you will be significantly different based on how long you let it think. And that's why I would call that thinking versus other behaviors not thinking.
Yeah, but like, so if a plant spends too much time in the sun, and say the stimulus of the sun does not change, like say it's just constant, right? Or light, right? Just say lux is constant. Eventually it will wilt. So that's a change in behavior if it doesn't get water, let's say, right? So is that because
Yeah. So I think thinking to me has to do with this kind of like almost like infinite scaling with time, where like with the plant, I think you can describe all the states it'll enter. And like older language models, if you ask them to just kind of write a longer response, they all basically eventually start picking a word and repeating the word over and over again. They enter this kind of terminal state that they can't get out of. And that's, I think, the plant wilting and eventually dying if it keeps being in the sun is this terminal state. I guess humans, if we don't eat, I guess we eventually die as well in the dark room example. But assuming that like sufficient energy is fed into us, we can use time and energy to just keep changing our behavior without degenerating. And I think that's like kind of a goal to aspire to for thinking for me.
Sorry, could I ask a question? So just adding to the plant thing. So imagine instead of wilting that it starts to prune its own leaves because it basically has decided that I receive sufficient sunlight to the leaves that I currently have, and actually I could probably get more out of it if I have less leaves. So would you say that the plant is thinking then? Because plants do this.
Sure. I think if the pattern of like pruning leaves and then growing towards the sun again, wilting, dropping leaves, and repeating, if this was not, if it was like a irrational number where like there's no repetition in the decimal, I would say that is a form of thinking, I guess. But I get, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I've not done like plant bio in a long time, but I assume that there is a pattern that you can describe with some pretty clear probabilities. Yeah.
Just going back to the thinking and then behavioral response output, and we can be comparing plants versus ChatGPT. You know, you look at it, but the architecture is different, right? So can you just judge the output and the behavioral response as, okay, that means it's thinking?
So is the idea here that the underlying system, the implementation should determine whether or not something is thinking?
Yeah, or does it?
I see. Yeah, I think so. I think this is very much up for debate. I personally, like, I guess there's this famous neuroscientist, David Marr, and he defined these like different levels of analysis. The the uppermost level is computational, where you try to describe computations that systems will do. Middle layer is algorithmic, which are like algorithms a system might use to implement those computations. And then finally, the bottom layer is the implementational layer, which for humans would be neurons, for plants would be like the cells and how it's responding. For an artificial neural network, they would be like transistors and a piece of hardware. And there, I think I define thinking at the computational level, but I think there's definitely an argument to be made to define it across all three levels, but I'm not, an expert on that. Thank you.
The examples that I heard so far are basically logical examples like AlphaGo and things like that. My question is, will we ever see artificial intelligence? Do you think we will ever see artificial intelligence thinking not just deductively, but also inductively or even abductively, which are usually more associated with creativity and imagination?
I guess I can start us off on this one. I think current systems struggle with, I guess in AI, people call it length generalization. So I'll give a simple example with how kids learn numbers, which I think is a good example of like an inductive rule that we learn where kids will actually first learn how to count, but they won't know what the numbers mean. Like they won't understand that 2 is 1 more than 1, 3 is 1 more than 2. Then eventually kids learn the concept of 1, and then they'll know what 1 is, and they'll know everything greater than 1 is something else. Then they'll learn what 1 is and 2 is, but everything greater. And then this continues until they learn like numbers up to 3 or 5, like somewhere in that range. And then they just get that you can always add 1, right? And then if you give a kid like 1,500,602, and I ask you what's one more than that, you've never seen this number before, but you can tell me what one more than that is. I think current systems, in terms of like being able to just continue a process forward, struggle with this, but it's a very big goal in the field right now. And I think O1 was like kind of this like mild breakthrough, I think, in that you now have systems that do just keep on like if you ask it a very difficult question, it'll try a certain way of solving the problem. It'll realize that doesn't work. It'll come up with a new way. It'll try that. And obviously, it can't keep doing this infinitely yet. But already comparing to like a year or two ago, where maybe you could only try like one or two solutions or strap on like a deductive process, now it seems to just be able to generate and like really just switch and explore different options, which I would say is a form of inductive reasoning, I think. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you so much for all your answers and the audience's contribution. We're going to move on to our next question.
Yeah, sorry for turning this into a plant convention. It's okay. We're not seeing you as the enemy against plants. But yeah, the next question is very related, of course. It's become clear that thinking can be in humans or other animals as well as artificial intelligence. But since the question of the discussion today is, can computational models replicate the full complexity of the brain? My question is, where does the complexity of the brain lie? And I'm going to direct this to Clem first and then Aaditya.
I would say there's many different levels at which it lies, and you could look at, I think, first obvious one is just how large the brain is and the scale of the brain, which makes it complex. It's a dynamical system that adapts over time and interacts with its environment, and that creates a lot of complexity as a dynamical system. And yeah, it's inherently hard to solve as a set of ODE. But not only that, I think the fact that the brain has distributed processing is another layer of complexity. So different regions have distinct sub-functions, and this makes it also more complex. And I guess the final level I would be thinking of is the emergent properties from these dynamical systems. So what we observe and they're able to do. So I guess some people call it consciousness or self-awareness that arise from these neural states and the complexity of the brain. So yeah, I don't know, Aaditya, if you want to add something on that.
Yeah, I think I like how Clem framed it with like there are many different levels. I guess I'll go to Mars levels again to kind of think about complexity and like in terms of how we, I guess, wait, so the question was where it lies or if we'll be able to replicate it or both? I kind of.
No, we're starting with the
where
basics.
It lies.
Where does
Okay.
it lie?
Cool. So I think, yeah, at all three levels, like Clem said, I think another thing I would add is like, just at like a molecular or cellular level, there's a lot of complexity in the brain that even in like our building where we mostly work at a systems neuroscience level gets abstracted away, but can actually be very important for clinical applications. There's obviously like understanding thinking, which you might be able to do at a higher level, but if you have a patient comes in who's like has some like genetic disorder or something that doesn't let them think as well, or like in various capacities, understanding the molecular basis can be really important. And yeah, I think that's just one of the things I would add, I guess. Really like Clem's result.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I appreciate that since you're in machine learning, I'm more on the biological side, so I appreciate that. But yeah, do we have any questions from the audience?
Does any of the other panelists want to?
Also, feel free to come up to the mic at the front if you ever want to contribute anything.
Hi, I'm Michelle. I think this might be a bit broad already. Maybe you shouldn't say this in the beginning, but like in the terms of like how well these like properties in the brain and the complexity could be, I think, modeled. Like, of course, there are many levels that we just discussed. And to a certain extent, I guess we will be able to model things, right? But as Clem said, when it comes to emergent properties, like I don't think we can even have an estimation of how far can technology advance and how fast. And as a matter of fact, because our definition of consciousness is so, how we will actually know if these actually have developed something that we call consciousness, or yeah.
That actually ties in really nicely with my next question, which I'm going to direct to Aaditya and Jai. And the question is, do you think computational models could ever replicate not just the functional aspects of the brain, but also subjective experiences like consciousness or emotion? If so, what would that mean for our understanding of what consciousness is? And what would it look like? Would it have a different manifestation from what we recognize as consciousness in humans?
Okay. I guess, okay, big topic. I think I'll tackle the audience question and then tie it in, I think, to Carolina's question. So I think in terms of like this complexity and like what it gives rise to, like these emergent behaviors, like consciousness, feelings, emotion, these sorts of things that we would describe more at a computational level than like lower level things like molecular cellular interactions and how those give rise to like algorithms and so forth. I think I actually have a pretty contrarian view here where I think that we can, I think we're going to actually grapple with those bigger picture things sooner and the more molecular details later. And I think that really comes to just, I guess, what we've learned in machine learning and AI of this like bitter lesson of scale, where it turns out when you have a lot of data generated from people who can think or are conscious or have emotion, and then you just learn this data really well, you end up, the argument goes that you end up having to learn some of that underlying structure. And then that'll lead to, like, if you're only looking at data generated by a conscious entity, at some point to truly understand and be able to predict that data, perhaps you also need to be a conscious entity. And so there, like, I guess a few papers that have kind of like started working in this domain, I would say there was this one work that I really liked last year where it's not like, don't worry, we don't have consciousness yet, as far as I know, right? But I think one example we often give for complexity that we don't really match in machine learning yet is this human ability to really interact very flexibly with our environment, like physically. The internet came out, humans didn't evolve to use the internet, now we all use the internet. We can adapt and we can learn how to interact with the environment. People argue that machine learning systems, which are viewed as kind of like passively trained on data, won't be able to interact. But there have been some pretty nice studies done with a lot of good controls to show that just learning from data generated by an active agent, passively learning from active data can actually lead to the emergence of active behavior at test time. So then going back to the bigger picture questions of consciousness and whatnot, I think in AI at least, there's a pretty common sentiment that once we have, or if and when we have the first like AIs that we would call conscious, we'll actually realize that we've had it for a while. And I think that ties to the audience question where I think these are things that are really hard to define. And so like, we're not going to realize they exist. I think similarly, a thought experiment I like to give myself is like, if there was just one human on the planet, right? And let's say there were no animals, they're just like plants, right? And so like they can go around, they're eating, drinking, everything. But would that person think they're conscious, right? Or is consciousness actually something that we get from our social interactions and theory of mind and these sorts of things? So yeah, just some, I guess, food for thought.
Very interesting. I like.
Aaditya, can I ask you a question on that? My understanding is that you say that we like train the AIs with data from humans or give feedback from humans to make them do more human-like tasks. And you, if I understood correctly, you argue that this could lead towards having conscious or like similar behaviors. But is there not a possibility that the AI misaligns and just like fakes, like I think it is a possibility that he finds the same consciousness that we have, but there's also a possibility that it is able to do it, but in another way, if that makes sense. And I think there has been like experiments showing, for example, just this experiment of picking up a ball by a robotic arm, and they gave feedback by humans, but the AI just learned to be in front of the ball such that the human would think it's picking it up, but actually was not picking it up and doing the task. So I think there are ways in which AI might misalign, even if you give it human data. And I think it's a space that may be so large that finding consciousness might be too complicated, or it would be luck.
Right. No, I think this is a really good point. I want to clarify that I wasn't arguing that, but I can see how I think what I said wasn't clear. Is I'm not arguing that just training on human data will lead to an aligned conscious AI. I'm saying that we can't argue that it won't. I think an argument is that it won't because it's not a brain, it's not interacting with the environment, but a lot of these things aren't necessary. Like learning to predict the well enough can often give rise to the same mechanism. Doesn't mean that it will necessarily give rise to that mechanism. I think it also depends on what level you define consciousness. Like if I had a system that, let's say, like, I don't know, we all talk to people online these days, right? There are some schools that are completely online. If you had like an AI student that said the exact same things as a normal student, right? A teacher would probably perceive them as conscious, right? Even though it's just like I can show you the code that's implementing the system. So if you factor in the implementation to your definition of consciousness, then you can definitely argue it's doing things differently. If you just look at it at a computational level, I think we might get systems that appear to be conscious or have emotion way sooner.
I would just like to ask, so for you, you think that in order to say that AI is conscious, it would need to look the same as a human or have the same type of responses? But we look at animals and, for example, plants, and you could argue they have consciousness. So would AI have the same type of manifestation of consciousness as humans? They have different architecture, they learn in a different way.
Yeah, so I think I should clarify again there. I think what I'm trying to draw a connection is if an AI behaved exactly like humans, we would think it's conscious. Not necessarily that that's the bar. That's like sufficient to deduce consciousness, but not necessary. I think AIs could behave in other ways. In fact, I think there are already some people who believe AIs are sentient. I wouldn't quite put myself in that category. Or I think I have many people in the building. Some of my other friends from my undergrad are now doctors or medical students. So I was talking to one of them about the subjective experience of pain, right? And what you would classify as an AI experiencing pain. And he was saying how like when humans are in pain, like they kind of focus all their efforts to reduce that pain, despite like limited computational resources or like ability to do things. They're just trying to reduce that pain, or they're expressing that pain very vocally, even though that doesn't necessarily reduce the pain, but in terms of seeking help. And then I told him about some behaviors that like early language models used to exhibit, where like sometimes models, like when you would ask them like a coding question, they would just start spouting like, I'm in pain, I'm in pain, I'm in pain, I'm in pain. And it's kind of eerie, right? When you're using it as a coding assistant, and instead of completing your like next code block, it just starts saying, I'm in pain. It feels kind of creepy. It feels a little bit eerie, right? I wouldn't quite call that like experiencing pain necessarily, because I can see how it's regurgitating some like Reddit post where somebody just like spam posted, I'm in pain. But at some point, I think the line gets very blurry very quickly.
What are your thoughts, Jay?
Yeah, I guess my first thoughts are like, we don't really know what consciousness is, right? I don't know what Aditya is feeling when I poke him. I don't know if it's what I'm feeling. Yeah. Like, all I know is like what I feel, right? So there's like the solipsist view or the philosophical zombie view. That's like, I don't know that anybody here in this room is conscious. I have my own perspective of myself, and that's all I have. And it's like Chalmers' hard problem, right? We don't have a good answer to it. We have no idea how to study it or quantify it. And science is all about, to me, quantifying things. So yeah, I think consciousness is why why a lot of people get really interested in psychology and neuroscience. They're like, oh, this is, I want to study, like when you start having metacognitive thoughts, you want to figure out what are the mechanistic properties behind that. And then you realize that it's really hard to study. So I'm kind of like a skeptic of consciousness research, or maybe not a skeptic, but like, to me, it's less interesting than capabilities research. And so for me, neuroscience, machine learning, they're both interesting because you get to see the output of intelligence rather than kind of theorize about what's happening under the hood. So I think it's kind of, I find it kind of silly to ask when we don't have a good way to quantify it.
Yeah.
And then just kind of to follow up on the RLLMs. So I guess the original question was, can machines be capable of developing consciousness or subjective feelings?
Yeah, if they could ever replicate subjective experiences like consciousness. And actually, I have a sub question which I hadn't mentioned, but ties into what you were saying, which is, could there be aspects of the brain that fundamentally cannot be modeled because they are intrinsically non-computable? And it's similar to what you were saying about whether or not we can quantify things. So would that be an aspect that we can never quantify because, well, we can never model because we can't quantify?
Yeah, so my short answer to the second question is, I think no, because I think I'm also computationalist like Pierre. So I think everything in the brain can be modeled and quantified. And then to go back to the LLM part of things, yeah, it's unclear. I think so. I do think like language is quite important for cognition and a feeling of self-experience. And yeah, I kind of do wonder if there is like proto-sentience, proto-consciousness in language models that exist today. And I think a lot of people wonder that. So I kind of agree with Aditya's point that I think there is something there. And I think it's kind of silly when people say, oh, we're biological organisms and these things are computer organisms. And so they will never be able to experience things the way we do. We both operate on electricity. So yeah.
Yeah. I want to give a bit of a counterpoint to the computationalist view, I guess, which is probably somewhat surprising because I was saying I like doing a lot of computational things. I used to give myself this thought experiment, again, with a lot of my biochem friends in undergrad, of at some point, when we have really, really good computing hardware, like massive supercomputers out in space or something, right, that are solar powered and super cooled, we could theoretically, to the best of our knowledge from physics and chemistry, simulate every molecular interaction, right? Of this 100, 200 years in the future. If you compare what we can simulate now to 100, 200 years ago, I think progress can be pretty breathtaking. It's maybe this won't be possible, but it's hard to dismiss that this won't be possible, right? And then in that case, if you have this computer system that's actually simulating every molecular interaction, maybe it's running slower than a human would, but it's still producing similar outputs. Would you say that the system has replicated consciousness or not? So I think that's a computational view. I think the flip side is and a lot of, I think, more philosophical people and cog sci and AI think about this is at some point you run into quantum mechanics and you can't actually exactly simulate these things. And so it's weird to think about does some quantum mechanical phenomenon mean we won't be able to simulate consciousness fully? But it's we have a bunch of atoms interacting and there are all these things we can't exactly measure. We don't know if those things cancel out, so to speak, and we could simulate it, or maybe they add together and create something that we actually just can never fully simulate. Yeah, I would say it's more of a toss-up.
I would just like to move on to the next question because it's actually very related. It's a question of scale, the question that's on my mind the most. So if we are trying to replicate the full complexity of the brain, what scale should our models be at? Synaptic, dendritic, neuronal, network, systems level? I'm going to direct this to Pierre and then Jay.
Yeah, so when thinking about scale, I think, obviously, I think what we all would like to do would be to have a very fine-grained model of the brain, right? So be able to describe what happens at the molecular level, for example, inside cells, but all the way up to the network system. So just consider just a lot of neurons, but modeled at the molecular level. In a sense, we'd get the best of both worlds, right? We'll define things very fine-grainedly, but also have access to the large-scale behavior arising in these kind of systems. The point, of course, is that if you just look at the number of parameters that there are in the human brain, so for example, the number of synapses, you have around 1,000 trillion synapses. So that 10 to the power 15 synapses. So if you take, for example, just a very basic computer that you might have, you may have, for example, 500 gigs or maybe 1 teragigs of memory, of just hard drive memory. And if you were to just simulate a brain for, let's say, 1 second, you would then end up with 10 to the power 16, sorry, if you assume just a 10 hertz granularity for the number of time points that you get per second, meter per second that you need to store. So you need 10,000 computers just for 1 second in terms of storing the number of the parameters just for 1 second. So I think to experience a scale is just going to be challenging. It might happen, but I think the progress has been made, for example, in 2 decades, be it the Human Brain Project or in the Blue Brain Project. I think we'll have this kind of moment where we can maybe say that these kind of things are not going to happen within our lifespan. I used to be surprised when I would hear scientists saying that when I was a kid, for example, on like number conjectures, people would say like, oh, I don't think this is going to be solved within my lifespan. I was always like, oh, the thing that like, what's going to be the future of research? And now, science, you start to have this kind of deduction thing just because it's such a hard idea. And like, I don't know, science is very slow or slower than I thought it would be. So I think we have to be a bit realistic in what we're going to be able to achieve within the next couple of decades. I think that long term, that's the thing we should tend to. We have actually a problem that's related to simulating, I guess, like, very, very fine-grained models at the large scale, which is hopefully what we would like to do is that all these parameters, these synaptic parameters, for example, they're very hard to measure. It's not only that we need to store the evolution, it's also that we need to come up with like reasonable, for example, parameters in the first place that would emulate the possible behavior, right? And this is not trivial, and that's where I think AI can help, right? AI essentially has been able to create this kind of like guessing machines, right? That actively change possible values for these parameters to make the brain replicate some observed experimental data coming for example, voltage recordings in neurons. So this we can easily measure, synaptic weights a bit harder. And so the idea is that AI can try by kind of like using the simulator of the brain, find correct parameters or plausible parameters for these systems. And once we reach that, we will be able at least to have like a satisfying models of this brain, let alone problems associated with like storing, etc. Now, data scale is a very, very hard problem. Actually, if you look at state-of-the-art models for this kind of machine learning algorithms, you end up with being able to set maybe 10,000 or 100,000 parameters. So we are very, very far away from the orders of magnitude that would be needed to get full brain simulation. But I think we can have to sacrifice a little bit in terms of the level of fine-grainedness that we want. There are some, even philosophical papers that may suggest that actually it's not so important to model until the very, very final scale. There's a very influential paper, I think, that I like to read, which is called The Architecture of Complexity by Herbert Simon. I think it was published in the 80s. And this paper essentially discusses the properties of complex systems and explains how they usually assemble in a hierarchical manner. And because these systems are hierarchical, sometimes the implementation detail of the smaller components matter too much for the behavior of the largest components. So in a sense, it might be okay if we abstract away a lot of the molecular details at the very low level in order to still replicate the kind of algorithmic properties of the brain. So I think in a sense, there is a chance that, like it's not that big of a deal if we end up with this kind of like great model of the brain.
Thank you. I think we have an audience question. Yeah, sorry, me again. I don't know if you guys think it makes sense, and of course, ignoring completely like all the limits that we have on how to calculate this, but maybe it would be good, like maybe what would really be it, like for the modeling of the brain would be how to integrate these different levels, as in what patterns and interactions between one level actually like dictate or like cause the like certain characteristics of the next level and so on, and then you get these points of interaction to actually build your model onto how the brain works. But yeah, I don't know what you guys would think about this. Completely implausible, I know, but yeah.
Actually, I think that's kind of related to what I was going to talk about. So I think, yeah, Pierre kind of hit the nail on the head when he said, yeah, if you want to fully model the complexity of the brain in terms of like, if you want to model what's happening at each synapse, right, you need an unbelievable large amount of storage. And even with, transistor creation today, I think there's more transistors now that have been created than grains of sand in the earth. Someone can fact check me on that.
Wow.
But like you'd still...
Like we're getting close to the number of like human sorry. think we're getting close to the number of human mitochondria.
Wow.
Yeah. But yeah, even like yeah, if you wanna model this thing, all these synapses for any amount of time, right? Well, we need way more storage than is feasible. But yeah, I think it's useful to think about modeling at different levels and what you can get out of that. So you can still find useful if we go back to Mars levels, right? You can find useful things modeling at super high level, like the computational level, down to the low level, the implementation level, and that kind of depends on what your question is, right? If you I was going to use a silly example, basketball game, right? If you care about predicting who's going to win a basketball game at the end of the fourth quarter, you don't care about things at the implementational level, really. You don't really care about, what air molecules are doing when LeBron is dribbling. But if you're interested in like predicting how often balls slip off someone's fingers, maybe you do care about things at a lower level. Maybe you do care about the heat, and what's going on like on his hand, and you want to model things at a smaller level. So it always, I think, depends on your question, and I think it's useful to model things at all three levels, depending on what your question is. And it's hard to combine models at all three levels to answer broad questions. Again, because I think you need probably a very large amount of compute to do things like that, and have like a very broad viewpoint. Maybe people in the audience or the panel have examples of people kind of successfully merging what I would call these like multi-level models. But I think that's like an unbelievably hard problem to do in science.
Can I have a question and just be slightly antagonistic? So like, like the hippocampus has a beautiful structure. It's amazing. Cerebellum as well, and molecules, genetics have all been involved to create this beautiful structure. But in the end of the day, neurons fire or they don't. So wouldn't you say at the level of systems and circuits is where, you would really find consciousness or any sort of complex thinking rather than, at the level of the molecules? What do you feel about that?
Me personally. Yeah, I think you probably will find, I think without thinking too deeply about it, or like from a naive point of view, I think you could find consciousness just in spiking activity. But I might be well wrong. Yeah.
So I think I agree that neurons either fire or they don't, but let's say you wanted to like predict whether a neuron is going to fire or it won't. It's not clear that all you need is like spiking history. Like I think there are a lot of molecular changes that can happen in a cell due to firing, right? So like the impact of presynaptic neuron firing on a postsynaptic neuron has a lot of time dependence, right? It's not just like whether or not it fired, the effect it'll have. So it's not like if there's some like way to describe this generally that you can model, then I would say that you could get some understanding from just looking at spiking activity. It's not clear to me that at the level of spiking activity, it's computable fully, or like it's fully determined, I guess. Like how spiking will be in the future, given how spiking has been in the past. Yeah. But I think like knowing lower level, like at some level, I think maybe that is fully determined, or maybe it's not, depending on like which school of thought you're in. I don't think spiking activity is necessarily the threshold. Or the other ones.
We also have a question from online that is sort of related to what Pierre was saying. So I'm just going to read it out. Do you think that this limitation of simulating at the level where quantum mechanical phenomena become a serious consideration could be solved or helped by the development of quantum computers? Obviously, this is a long way away, but given a few hundred or even 1,000 years, let's say.
I think if you abstract away the problem of time, we can do a lot of things, right? So just like it's absolutely, I'm not taking this necessarily as a job, but in a sense, for example, simulate a brain, it's just going to take a lot of time. And then there's a question of data storage, etc. But like, yes, yeah, my guess is that like there are multiple ways in which we can already kind of do this. The question is like, can we do this within a reasonable time frame, essentially? And I think maybe we can, like, I think in general, alternative ways of computing will help. Be it either quantum computer or computers, for example. I think essentially exploring, or just even, for example, physics-inspired computers, which are essentially computers that do not necessarily store information at the digital level or do not perform digital computation, but perform analog computation, like our brain. Our brain is analog, right? It uses physical signals in order to process information, where, yes, whereas like computers are digital. And so exploring computing systems along that scale is to scale up computation through the scaling up of energy efficiency, because analog systems are usually much more efficient. So I think quantum computers, whether for exactly on that scale, I don't know, but I think exploring in general kind of alternative paradigms for computing and computing systems is a very important quest in order to scale up the amount of computation that we can do. So yes, I agree with the question.
So fundamentally, we don't know enough about the brain to be able to answer the main question at hand of the debate, which is whether computational models can replicate the full complexity of the brain. We can't build a brain, but we can build a model. So my next question is for Clémentine and Aaditya, which is, what do you think is the biggest flaw in computational models that is hindering them from being as complex or computationally powerful as the brain?
Do you want to start, or should I?
Yeah, I can give a start. I think some of these questions have been answered, to be fair, in the previous answer, but yeah, contrary to Aaditya, I do think that maybe due to the fact that we are not operating on the same substrate, there might be differences in the type of intelligence we can see, not that it can surpass it, but I think it might make it difficult to replicate exactly what the brain is doing. I think it will be hard to perfectly align. So I do think this is one fundamental flaw. But also, I think that we don't know enough about the brain to fully replicate it. So I guess the questions that I am asking is that really the goal? Do we really want to just replicate the brain exactly, or do we want to understand intelligence and computation at large scale, and in this process really develop tools and develop both our understanding of machine learning and the brain in parallel, that will both help understand each other and I guess develop each other across time. But I don't think, at least my personal goal is to replicate intelligence, is more so understanding it.
Where to start? Okay, I guess I'll start with a personal anecdote. I think so Carolina was asking about the kind of what's missing, right, so to speak, in computational models. So when I started in AI and neuroscience, I guess I came actually from the neuroscience side, where it's really interested in the brain and understanding intelligence. And then I guess the way I thought about it was either that understanding will lead to clinical impact or helping build intelligence. And I decided that I wanted to focus on the latter, so I got more focused onto AI and been thinking about what's missing in these models and how can we make them more like the brain at the computational or algorithmic levels. And I think many people thought this is, well, currently the way we do artificial neural networks were a huge breakthrough, and they kind of have these artificial neurons, right? But they're pretty different from neurons in the brain. What if we make them at an implementational level more similar to the brain? And then I worked on that for a bit, or trying to figure out how neurons in the brain are interacting to produce language, trying to put more of that into artificial neural networks. But basically, all of these things didn't really work out in the AI side of things. And the real answer that's kind of really become a prevailing narrative is scale. Where here, by scale, we don't mean the level of abstraction, but literally just the total amount of compute you dedicate to something. And there, what people found is that simple algorithms scaled well on a lot of data just are really good at modeling behavior. And when you model behavior well enough, you get emergent phenomena. And so I think in terms of what computational models are lacking, I think a big part of it is actually just scale. I think there are big questions in how to scale a system, right? Training on more data doesn't always help when you've already used all the good data on the internet. I mean, we've all used the internet. We know most of the internet is not good data that is good for learning. So at some point you run out of that, and then there's a question of how you continue to scale. But I think if we can just keep figuring out how to dedicate more computational resources, I think will get systems that aren't replicating the brain. But I think similar to Clem, I'm not interested in like replicating the brain as much as like getting some of these qualitative features of intelligence in autonomous.
If I can add something, I think something also that came to mind when you were speaking, some people have argued that something that is missing after scale, which I think is a really great point, is embodiment. So the ability to have direct inputs from the environment, such as, I don't know, light or perception, things like that, that would allow potentially to get AI to another level. And I think some people are working towards that to make it also more human-like and closer to neuroscience.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. So I'll share my take on this. This is not by any means like the take of the field or anything, right? It's my personal beliefs. So I think for like, obviously, if you want a robot that can walk around and talk and do things like a human in a physical environment, of course, embodiment is really important. I think for various features of intelligence, like thinking, perhaps even consciousness, feeling, I don't think that a physical environment is actually necessary. I think that it's, so I can give an example, right? Like if I tell you that I have this credit card with a blue whale on it with a credit limit of like, I guess, I don't know if people use credit cards, your debit card with a blue whale on it. And whenever you buy something blue, you get a 20% discount. None of you have ever experienced this debit card, credit card, whatever in your life. But if I went and asked you about how you would use it, you could tell me, right? You would like think about blue things. I'm sure many of you started thinking about like blue things you like to buy, and then how this credit card will help you save money on those. And so I think this is an example of, in philosophy and linguistics, what people call conceptual role semantics, which is this idea that words, objects, and things get their meanings from their relationship to other words, rather than just a physical instantiation. For example, like someone could tell you, we were just talking about this before the panel, like many people like my parents who are from India, they didn't experience snow until they were like 25 or something when they moved to the US, right? And so they could talk about snow, right? They could explain what causes snow, right? What precipitation might look like, even though they had never experienced it. They could reason about snow. They could think about snow. They could imagine how they'll feel when they experience snow. Now, whether or not those actually matched what they felt when they saw snow isn't what I'm getting at, right? The point is they can do a lot of these qualitative experiences we associate with thinking and intelligence without having actually physically experienced the sensation. And this is kind of why I don't think embodiment is per se necessary for thinking, feelings, consciousness.
I was actually just going to ask both of you. So both of you mentioned how your own takes on what understanding is not just replication or recreation, it's something more. And I think as researchers, we all want to have a feeling of understanding. And that's what like publishing is about. When you think you have a good enough understanding of something that you can write it down and tell other people what you've discovered. But I still think it's a problem for me personally, and I think for a lot of people, is like, what is a satisfactory level of understanding? And specifically regarding, let's say, computations in a nervous system or like intelligence, let's just call it. What, to both of you, Clem and Aaditya, like, what do you find as a satisfying explanation of intelligence? Either you could think of like a particular example of something maybe you published in your own work, or broadly in nervous systems, what would you be happy with?
You want to start, Aaditya?
I'm gonna break your question into two because I think there are two things. The first one was like what we view as understanding, because I think this is a problem that like every scientist struggles with. So I think to answer the understanding intelligence, I have to explain what understanding is to me. I'll give an example. Like, let's say you want to learn about a new topic, like you're planning a trip to New Zealand, right? And you want to figure out where to go. So you'll start on Google probably, or maybe ChatGPT now, but let's pretend like Google days, right? You go onto Google, you search up things to do in New Zealand. You'll get a TripAdvisor link. Then there's like multiple things. You can click on each of those. That'll send you to another webpage. And you can kind of keep going, figuring out more and more details about your experience, right? And that's going to help you understand what it's like to visit New Zealand better and better. And you can kind of just get lost. So in terms of what an abstraction computer scientists like to use is like search, where like you could read about like 10 high-level things you can do in New Zealand, like cities. And then you could go into like 2 activities in each city, and you could kind of like go by level, right? Diving deeper and deeper. That's known as breadth-first search. Another option is depth-first search, where you kind of pick a city, you look at what to do in that city, you go there, then you look at like reviews for that thing, then you go into those, and you just keep diving deep before you come back out. For me, understanding is actually a form of what I call depth-limited search, where I kind of go down deep enough and come back out, not when I fully understand, because I haven't really gone as deep as I would want to, but when I know enough that I'll know when I want to come back to this. So for me, understanding intelligence would mean understanding the different pieces well enough that I understand when I need to go in and open up one of those boxes and look deeper. So yeah, it doesn't like quite concretely answer your question, but maybe some examples would be like, we have equations for what causes a neuron to fire, right? And these equations have constants for like channel capacities, right? Which are influenced by the number of channels. Now, I don't know the number of channels on an average neuron, but I know that if I really want to accurately simulate one, I would have to find that out, plug that into the equation, and go from there. So to me, that equation enhances my understanding because it gives me like a node in my tree that I'll know when I need to go back and expand. So yeah, when we have enough of those nodes, I guess.
Yeah, I think to that, I think my level of understanding is I would like something that when I modify it, I can accurately predict what it does as an output. And I think that can be an equation, but that can also be something that is less precise than an equation, but it's something that you can accurately statistically predict when you modify it, or if I do something, what is the output. And I think to me, this is understanding, and it can happen at different levels, as Aaditya mentioned. And I think that's satisfying for me. But yeah, philosophically, and I think it's an endless question what understanding is.
Thank you. I really like both of your answers. It's very reasonable when someone asks you, when will we have solved the brain to answer like that. So now I'd like to open up this question to the audience, and we have one from the back.
I'm going to stand up because I'm kind of in the back.
Yeah.
So you guys talk about the when you're doing simulations, actually calculating each thing. And I mean, nowadays, when we do like a lot of simulations, we're starting to use AI and a lot of like games and computation that used to, you have to program each thing. You can just train an AI model to simulate the real world. And so it seems to me like if you want to simulate a brain, then the question is, well, at which level are you going to train the AI model to copy? So you want to copy like this brain region and try and make the AI copy that brain region exactly, or just try and make an AI just imitate every single thing a human does, and maybe hopefully that does a good enough job simulating a brain. Does my question make sense?
I feel like the statement made sense. Sorry, what's the question?
The question is of which level do you think it's the most important to simulate, and whether AI can be used to do the simulations?
Yeah, I guess
somewhat, I guess.
Sorry. Yeah, I guess my short answer would be, I think, as I said before, it kind of depends what level you're looking at. Another short answer is that I guess people do use AI right now, like they use deep learning models to simulate parts of brains. Right. Alan's not here, but he yeah, so people do use like deep learning models to simulate what they hope are like small networks in the brain and communication within a network or between those networks. So kind of that's already happening. But yeah, I think it really, yeah, so I guess I'd say AI is already being used to simulate the brain. And then I think it's useful to think about what level of explanation you want to give to something when you're thinking about how to simulate that thing.
I think it also highlights what Jay said earlier about if you can combine scales in models, which is also a question I always have because I don't do modeling. But that's something to think about as well, I guess. Just will that benefit our understanding of the brain if we are able to combine scales in our models?
I'll add a practical consideration, and like Pierre was saying, like there's a difference between thinking about like what we'll eventually be able to do and what we can do in the near future. To what Jay was saying, we're like, depends on what level you're looking at, but also in terms of applying AI to like understanding parts of the brain, you end up being more limited by what you can actually, like what data you can get to train an AI model on. Like AI models to get accurate simulations are very data hungry. A lot of the places where we've made big progress, like I guess most recently protein folding, it's because there was already like ginormous data set of like RNA sequences to the protein structures, right? If somebody had tried that same effort 20 years ago, they wouldn't have been able to make the same system, even given the same compute. So I think in neuroscience, we get this issue where currently I would say AI models mostly mimic the brain at the computational level because that's really easy to observe, especially like language, like people talk, right, on the internet all the time. So you can copy that. If you want to simulate like a part of the brain, you end up being limited by the data you can collect there, especially with humans. It's very tricky to collect a lot of data without doing a lot of surgeries and sticking needles into people who don't want needles in their brain. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think like one aspect of simulating is the fact that like as soon as you're there are two things, right? Like in a sense, for example, if you're just interested about a specific part of the brain and you're asking why using deep learning to simulate that part, the question can be just speed, right? Because you want to simulate, for example, the Hodgkin-Oxley equation, which is the equation that drives the way the voltage evolves at a neuron's brain, right? You can just solve the differential equation that's associated with it, and you don't need deep learning to do that, right? You can just solve it. But what you can simulate a bunch of times, give it to a machine learning algorithm, and be like, okay, can we try to learn to simulate that? And if you give it enough examples, at some point the AI will be able to just replicate it to solve this differential equation without actually solving it, right? Just by knowing statistically the way this differential equation solution look like. But as soon as you do that, you essentially lose a lot of interpretability. Right. There are no parameters, there are no physical parameters in machine learning algorithm or in a deep learning algorithm. It's just like fully connected or various kind of layers stacked on top of each other. So interpretability of that system. And in a sense, we're seeing that at various levels of the AI stack, right? If you look at like large language models, they're pretty much used to like essentially simulate a brain, but at the highest possible levels, which is like trying to predict what a human will say next, given what he said before. Right. This is pretty much simulating the brain in some extent, right? But at the very, very, very large, I mean, yeah, I'm making a simplification, but you get my point. At the very highest level, we lose interpretability. It's very hard to say what's going on in this kind of models. So I think you really have to use them wisely. They can be very useful. For example, LLMs are very useful. All the parts of the brain where we don't care about the logical implementation details, it can be very useful to use deep learning instead. Because we lose interpretability.
I think we have a question from the audience.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, is it possible that the lack of embodiment is why we need so much scale at the moment? Like, for example, if you're learning to play tennis, you don't learn through doing differential equations, you learn through actioning it. And also is a big limitation of AI at the moment that it spends the same amount of compute on each token.
I guess I can start this one probably because I was the most anti-embodiment probably of all of us. So on the tennis example, I would actually caution that when we learn to play tennis, it's not just like our examples we're looking at. First of all, like, and let's even pretend you've never seen someone play tennis, right? You're still building on like millions of years of evolution that have imparted in you like fine motor control that then is easily adaptable to playing tennis. So if you actually added up all the computation done by evolution for millions of years, it's way, 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 way more than the scale we train our AI systems at. And AI systems really do start from scratch, right? Like knowing nothing. And so there, I wouldn't necessarily think that embodiment would make things easier to learn. But yeah, it's an open, I guess like so far, it hasn't seemed to be the case either that like embodying things typically just makes things harder. That's because we don't really know how to represent those things, how to control those things. It's like if you were trying to teach like, I don't know, like an animal without opposable thumbs to do most of the tasks that humans currently do today by giving them like an extra like thing they can click on that acts like an opposable thumb. It would take them a longer time to learn it.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
So I wanted to say I was quite happy to hear earlier that you mentioned alternative forms of intelligence, like neuromorphic and all that. I had a question earlier, which was essentially why are we talking only about the silicon-based kind of AI? But yeah, that was kind of touched upon. But that leads to a kind of follow-up question, which I don't exactly know how to contextualize, but it has to do with the idea that biological systems seem to have a continuous learning, while the AIs that we have right now seems to have somewhat a discrete learning or a discrete, say, discrete steps or discrete actions that they are doing. So just wanted to ask about whether this is a part of kind of the literature or if that informs the research directions in any way.
Clémentine, do you want to take that one?
Maybe I want to understand better the question. By discrete, do you mean like there's different training periods? Or do you mean that they update themselves through discrete increments of the learning rate, for example?
Yeah, so for instance, if I'm referring more for after they have been trained, for instance, for them to actually do something, you need to kind of do discrete steps, right? So, or they need to do discrete steps, if that makes sense.
After training, to learning. So I'm not sure if I fully understood the question, but in my understanding nowadays, people use as feedback your own data as you use chatbots, for example, which could be considered as a continuous learning mechanism. I'm not sure if this is what you thought or had in mind.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking in terms of time. So if you were to model how it works, it would be essentially discrete time steps because you would need to. Does that make sense?
I think yeah. So I think maybe another way to phrase it, correct me if I'm wrong, is also so classically in deep learning models, let's say before transformers, there's like a strict training step, and then there's an inference happens after. So the model's typically not learning. So it goes through this learning phase where you give it an example and it learns to do something with that example, right? Classify some object that's in it, recreate the example itself, various different things, and you feed it a bunch of examples until it's fully learned. And then later it goes through inference where it's not learning anymore. It's just like you feed in the example and it's outputting something, but there's no changing of its weights, right? It's already learned and now it's just performing inference. And maybe your question is why do humans seem to do this continuously, both learn and act, but models don't?
Sorry, maybe we're all hearing a different question. I thought you were asking that like our human experience appears continuous, whereas models will like output one word at a time. Which of the three so far closest to your question?
This one actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'll just say something quick and then I can hand it back off. I actually don't like. I think we view our experience as continuous because I guess we kind of have no option. But like there are a lot of studies in neuroscience that I really like where like if you flash an image in front of someone for like less than 50 milliseconds, they won't even like register seeing it, right? Or like there's like a frame rate that our eyes work at. And so in that sense, you could argue that our experience is discrete, just at a very fast rate. And I think it just means that like what I experience in 1 second is maybe what like a machine learning model experiences 1 minute, but as compute gets faster and faster, it'll speed up and match. But
I agree a bit with Aaditya was saying. I think it's very true, right? That like a lot of AI algorithms essentially work, I think, at the algorithmic level, and at the algorithmic level, it just makes sense to do things in discrete time because discrete times represents the fact that you are just doing one action and then one other action is just the precise kind of like nature of a computer program to operate in discrete time, right? So when you're in continuous time, I think that you're entering essentially mechanistic dynamics and not necessarily algorithmic concerns. So it becomes a bit harder because essentially you're shifting the focus, in my opinion, of AI algorithms when you write them in continuous time. Now, for example, I think a lot of AI algorithms that are discrete time are just very interpretable in what they're doing and have at least that feature of being able to learn and act kind of in an intermingled manner. If you look at, for example, reinforcement learning algorithm or bandits, right? They interact with the environment, they update their parameters, and then they do some action in a discrete manner, because really what the algorithm is doing, the specification is a discrete time algorithm, right? It just makes sense. And as soon as we're in continuous time, then this all becomes a little bit blurry. There are some fine lines, right? So for example, there are continuous time versions of gradient descent, which is a famous optimization algorithm, or for example, continuous neural ODEs are specific algorithms that were initially thought of as being just like discrete time operation, but that turned out have a continuous time limit. So I think it's very interesting to see if algorithmic kind of procedures can have continuous time analogs. And in that case, we may be able to define, I think, algorithm in a continuous time manner. But in many times, the discrete time aspect just relates to the fact that we're really focused on the algorithm and not so much on the mechanistic implementation.
Really interesting. Thank you for the question. I'm going to just ask. Okay, there's another question.
Okay, so machine learning models we have right now are running on computers which have like ones and zeros, right? And that creates a sort of software layer on which they operate. But like as human beings and everything around us, it operates on a more fundamental level. So do you need the LLMs to also be working on that level, or the AIs to have true intelligence, or can they still work on this like higher level?
Yeah, I have an experience.
So I guess one thing that you seem to be referring to is the analog versus digital difference. I guess like computer operate in a digital manner, right, compared to in-person digitally, whereas like human brains, for example, work more in an analog manner. And I think to some extent, I would say that one of the reasons why the brain, or I mean, there is all this concept of organic matter also that's important. But I think one key feature of the brain that sometimes we forget is that it's super energy efficient, much more than computers. And in a sense, a lot of like what seems to be different in the brain compared to AI algorithms may be the results of evolution constraining the structure of the brain so that it maximizes its energy efficiency for a given set of tasks that it should be able to do, right? And so this kind of difference, they may seem important in the first place, but actually in the light of this constraint may not seem so important. So my first actually thought would be that no, we shouldn't try, if the goal is just to replicate human intelligence, or at least or even to make it better, to like go back to an analog medium if it turns out that it's more energy efficient, but we shouldn't go. And actually, in a very a maximalist sense, there is nothing that a Turing machine cannot do, right? And so in a sense, I don't know whether or not, just for the purpose of constructing intelligent systems, at least, we should come back to analog mediums apart from energy purposes.
Quickly add something on analog versus digital, because I think it's come up a few times. So, and like others, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I think the way I think of this actually, if you look historically, early, the first signs of neurons were continuous, right? They didn't spike. This is true, right? In the sponges. Yeah, graded potentials. Yeah. But now we have neurons that spike. Similarly, the first examples of what you could call computation with electricity, were analog signals, right? A lot of measurement tools are still analog. The reason, at least in computer science, I think people switch to digital is because it's just way more robust to noise, right? If you're measuring an analog signal exactly versus bits, it takes more to corrupt a bit than to slightly move a voltage signal, right? And so I think digital, both in how we use transistors, but also now we have neurons that spike or not. I think some sensory organelles are still graded potentials, but our main I guess cognitive computation is all in terms of spikes mostly. It seems like both evolution and biology and computer scientists felt that for some reason these discrete signals allow for more noise robust or something computation. So it's not clear to me that going back is necessarily a good thing, or having your fundamental unit of computation being an analog signal. But yeah.
Yeah, just to conclude on that, we're just essentially exploring, I think, the various trade-offs between being energy efficient and being robust to noise, I think. And now all of this neuromorphic hardware are essentially trying to push the cursor between something that is super robust to noise, which is modern commodity computers, and something that is more, I think, less robust to noise, but in a sense, like much more energy efficient, which is our brain.
That links really well to the last very quick question I wanted to ask, which is, do we need to replicate the full complexity of the brain? So it has been mentioned, Clem asked this question, and I'm going to ask it back to you. Do we need all the details at the nanoscale, at all the scales, to replicate intelligence, for example, starting with Clem?
I would encourage advances at all scales in general. I think it's hard to predict at which scale it would be interesting. I personally don't think we need it, but I don't know. I don't think we can know exactly where it lies, and I think it also is based on different interests, cognitive abilities, and abstracting a lot of details at that level. And I do think we will be able to say something about intelligence, and at another level, they will probably be able to say something different about intelligence and its mechanism. So yeah, I think that would be my general answer.
Can we have a quick answer from all the other panelists?
Yeah, I'd say to replicate, like, let's say human level intelligence, I don't think you need to replicate the brain, the complexity of the brain. The brain does a lot of things that are important for us that we wouldn't consider intelligence, just keeping us alive, right? We went through this process of evolution where I forget how long our cortex has actually been developing, but like from early primates to us now, there's been a lot of evolution, you know, even before then. From like, if we look at a mouse's brain compared to a human's brain, just the amount of volume that's in cortex, the relative amount of volume that's in cortex is much smaller in mice than us. So their brains are doing a lot of things that aren't what we would consider intelligence. So I think if we just want to replicate what we consider intelligence, you don't need to replicate all these other things the brain is doing.
I'll add in, I guess, go back to my favorite framework of like Mars computational levels. I guess to me, like understanding intelligence is interesting in a few ways. One is just the scientific endeavor, and I think like we're very privileged that we get to just like work on this. In terms of like impact, positive impact on the world, to me, the two directions I see are like kind of clinical impacts, where I think the implementational understanding is important, but then I think like implementation and algorithm is very important. Then like how that ties to like higher level behavior, you might not need to actually understand that to provide clinical therapies. Vice versa, for building intelligence, I think the most important level is the computational. After that, like some interaction with algorithmic is probably useful. How much understanding of like molecular interactions in a neuron will help building intelligent systems artificially, unclear to me. So I think like in that sense, I guess my view, like I don't think we need to have a system that replicates all three levels at the same time, but kind of understanding these different pieces will be useful for different applications.
Yeah, definitely agree with what everyone just said before. Just I think a nice order of magnitude to keep in mind is that one of the most state-of-the-art language models up there right now, Llama 3, on which Aaditya has worked, can be implemented in, I think, 400 lines of code. I don't know, like, there's a file you can implement Llama in, like, the training, etc. The architecture. The architecture can be replicated in 400 lines of code. So is, I think, telling in regards of like what should we push for in terms of like achieving very high level intelligence. This is crazy that we can have much intelligence baked in such a source code compared to how much, like, I think strengths will to understand the brain.
Just so that people don't get the wrong impression, like, yes, 400 lines of Python code, but like that's relying on like the whole Python interpreter, which is relying on assembly of like, if you wanted to connect transistors to like intelligent Llama 3, if you would call it intelligent, which I think it's a great model, I wouldn't call it like intelligent per se. There's a lot more there than just similar to like how to connect neurons to like our higher level thoughts. There's like many subsystems contributing. But yeah.
Thank you. So just to finish, oh, sorry.
No, yeah, I think, sorry, we have to wrap up. Sorry
Yeah.
for turning down questions, but
Yeah.
for time.
So today we were hoping to probe the limits of our knowledge regarding computational models and neuroscience and what it would take for them to be able to replicate the brain. Or if it's simply an epistemological gap that can't be breached. I really enjoyed all the arguments made. I have to say they were extremely convincing, even as a neuroscientist. From whether everything is deterministic, from particles to plants to computational models, as well as looking at the architecture of complexity. However, there were some undeniable points made on the biological side of things. We were talking about the example of tennis and how humans rely on evolution. However, a baby also starts from scratch, and we're able to learn things so much faster than the brain. And there's also the point that we can build a model, but we can't build a brain. But overall, I really enjoyed all the arguments made today.
And to finalize the event, we're going to ask everyone in the room to vote for whether they agree or disagree that computational models will be able to replicate the brain. So first, please put your hand up if you think, yes, computational models will be able to replicate the full complexity of the brain. Wow. Okay. And now put your hand up if you think no, computational models will not be able to replicate the full complexity of the brain.
Neuroscientists versus computationalists. Okay.
And Pierre.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, the panelists. Let's give everyone here a big